Hello. Today's scripture passage is found in the second chapter of the Gospel of John, starting with verse 1 and reading on through verse 11, and the story goes. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. We'll come back to that story in a second, but first a question. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt that you did not exactly belong? And I don't mean not belong in a bad way here. I mean more like, pinch me. I can't believe I've been invited here, been given access here. I can't believe that those around me have told me that it is here that I belong and have welcomed me here. You may find yourself thinking things like, this is too much, too extravagant. And here is where you get the sense that you must be dreaming or that you've been elevated beyond your station. And yet, those who've invited you to the party insist that you belong. They would never have invited you otherwise. Perhaps a few examples of the sort of thing I'm talking about will help. It's what I imagine I'd feel like if an airline told me that I'd been bumped up to first class simply because they could, as if they ever would. But either way, I can imagine how it'd go. They say something like, "No, sir, we insist. Sit back and relax in your recliner chair. Here's a hot towel. A menu will be brought out to you shortly. In the meantime, why don't you take a nap?" A nap which you'll be able to comfortably take because you're in first class. I don't know if you can tell, but I've never sat in first class before, but I've seen it in the movies. However, there have been times in my life when I have in fact found myself in places where I felt that I very much did not belong. Invited into places where I felt as though I was being lavished with gifts and privileges I did not think I would ever experience, nor did I even expect to. My wife Kelly and I have more than once been treated to vacation homes or to hotel rooms on someone else's dime. And most often these opportunities have come in times in our lives when we could have scarce afforded to pay for those accommodations ourselves. But a friend or a relative perhaps will invite us there and insist our treat. And when this happens, we unlock the room upon arrival and we breathe in the perceived costly air. And we look at each other, both thinking the same thing. We cannot believe we are allowed to sleep here. But for me, the memory that sticks out more than others is when we were invited to the Scottish Wright Cathedral in downtown Indianapolis for a wedding reception. If you don't know the building, it's a large and exceedingly extravagant place, very fancy and very costly. I can remember meeting my brother and my father just outside of that building to drop off our then infant daughter, which we could not bring to the reception. And they were going to watch our daughter for that night while we enjoyed the evening. And I can remember standing by the building with them, trying to explain that this was not usual for us, that we in fact could not believe for the life of us that we were meant to spend the evening walking around inside of that impressive building. And not because we snuck in, but because we were invited in. These are not the sorts of places that I had ever belonged in before, and I haven't stepped into that building since. But on that night, we belonged. As we sat at the table, our eyes could not help but be drawn upwards to the high ceiling, the architecture, the different levels. It seemed as though we were dining in something between a castle and an old church. And the floors, I can remember, were marble and had a fancy design. And the waiters even were dressed better than I was. I could not help but feel that I did not belong, and yet I had received the invitation to that party months ago in the mail. The bride and the groom are our friends. Well, as the evening progressed, our awareness that for that time and in those moments we belonged in that space, well, this began to settle in, and we began to enjoy ourselves and even feel more in our own element. Still, we could not believe it, and yet pinch ourselves. This is where we belong, right here, right now. The point of today's story about Jesus and a wedding long ago is to make a similar point, but if possible, on a much grander scale. The point being, and I'll let you in on it before we get to the end even, you are invited to the party, to the table God prepares. What's more, this place we are invited to enter into, the realm of God, is more than we have ever expected. Indeed, more than we ever dared to dream for. Our story begins with the words, on the third day. So this is happening 3 days after what? Well, if you go back 3 days, you'll read how Jesus had begun to call his disciples together around him just 2 days prior. So this is to cue us into the fact that the disciples have only recently embarked on this journey. Their call to follow Jesus is but 3 days old. So on the third day, they are with Jesus at this wedding, and they don't know what to expect. All they know is that they've answered the call to come and see, to leave what they've known, to discover what may happen as they walk along the path with Jesus. Then just days after answering the call, they find themselves invitees to a wedding. The second verse makes it very clear. They are invited. So what a treat to be invited, to be included. But very quickly, the wine gives out, which tells us what sort of party this may be. Probably this was to be expected. Probably this was not the kind of party where the host could afford to treat the people to an endless supply. As an aside, I'll just mention how modern readers often miss the forest for the trees here, turning to questions about the morality of drinking alcohol, trying to find some teachings in that strain from this story. And I just got to say, such questions miss the point. There are numerous Bible verses warning about the dangers of inebriation and the importance of staying sober, keeping your right mind and your focus sharp. The main point of this story is not about these things. To get at the main point, you would have to understand what wine had come to symbolize in antiquity, in the times of Jesus and before then. To produce wine back then assumed that you had a community around you with enough time and resources to make it, simply put. It assumed that you had enough excess food to set some of it aside and allow it to ferment. In other words, to allow it to, in a way, go bad. In other words, to allow it to spoil for the sake of a special treat. If you were hungry, it would make better sense to eat the grapes off the vine. And somebody who was starving would in fact do that. It wouldn't even be a thought of making wine. You take in the calories as they come. But in those days, to be a person who can afford wine assumes that you possess a certain amount of stability in your life, not to mention resources. It assumes that there are persons around you who have the space in life to set aside time to oversee the process, to even become experts at it and make fine wines. So instead of laboring in fields, they have the time to stomp on grapes and to make, produce, and then fill wineskins, which, by the way, required animal skins, which is another resource that the community could scarce to give up unless it had enough to do so. You get the picture. So wine is a product of abundant resources. And because of this, centuries before Jesus arrived on the scene, wine had come to serve as a symbol. It symbolized times in the life of the people when the community was healthy, well, and cared for, existing in a time of peace and able to live well because they had all they needed and probably then some. Good wine and a community's ability to procure it came to serve as a sign of God's blessing, that God's blessing was being lavished on that community. Moses described the promised land to which he was leading the Israelites out of slavery as a land of grain and wine. Deuteronomy 33, verse 28. And in the book of Isaiah, from which Jesus often quoted, the holy mountain to which God will call all peoples together is described just after Isaiah describes how the poor, the needy, the foreigner, and those in distress will find refuge and safety on God's holy mountain. That's part of the picture. We read the following words. This is the kind of life the poor and the needy and the foreigner are meant to find at the mountain. Chapter 25, verse 6. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. Then Isaiah goes on to describe how death will be swallowed up here and how every tear will be dried from the faces of the people. But here, wine is used symbolically to describe the richness and fullness of the life we are to find in the place to which God is leading us. Wine symbolizes richness of life and the lavish ways God will bestow blessing and grace on the people. And today, we believe that this includes us, that we are invited. More on that in a moment. Back to the wedding in Cana. The disciples and Jesus are invited, but the wine runs out. And this, as we've come to see, should not probably surprise us. The family throwing the party were probably doing all they could to ensure that the supply of wine that they had might stretch far enough, but it has limits. This was not the sort of community that could likely spot an endless supply. And here, Jesus is presented with the problem. It was, after all, probably embarrassing for the host to run out of anything, much less wine. Everyone would know, okay, it's not one of those kinds of parties. It's a little lower down on the social scale. So after a dicey interchange between Jesus and his mother, Mary tells the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. And this sets the stage for a demonstration of the power of God and of the nature of the life Jesus brings us. Keep in mind what we just read from Isaiah 25. It's that kind of life we're talking about here. Life that transforms us, life that restores us, life that leads to peace, life that elevates the lowly. Similar to the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus takes very little and turns it into a lot. Here he begins with but one of wine's ingredients. True, wine is no substitute for water, but it does contain quite a bit of water. And when grapes are squeezed, water is pressed out of them along with everything else. But everyone knows that water alone is not enough. Water is not wine, not by itself. Jesus takes what seems like not enough and turns it into more than enough, more than was expected. And the scale of the miracle should not be overlooked. The water is poured into 6 stone ceremonial jars, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. We'll round that out to about 25 gallons each, which, if you do the math, comes to 150 gallons of wine. I don't know how many people were at that party, but 150 gallons of wine is a lot in any case. Here is far more than expected, more than enough, and then some. If wine symbolizes life beyond our wildest hopes, it's as if Jesus is communicating to his disciples, are you looking for richness, fullness of life? Says Jesus, I'll meet the hopes you hold and double them, quadruple them even. I'll supply you life beyond what you had ever dared to dream. The sheer volume of wine Jesus produced at the wedding is to remind us of the vision of the prophets like Isaiah and Joel and others. Visions of a time when all people will find themselves full of life and possessions of every good thing. By this miracle, we are meant to see that Jesus brought this kind of life with him. As we walk along with Jesus, we expect to experience this kind of fullness and richness, and on a grand scale. By now, you can probably anticipate the next point to be made. I hardly need to point out the significance of the quality of the wine at this point. Not only is there a lot of it, but its quality is impeccable. The steward, the fella in charge of the feast, was not in on the proceedings. He didn't know what Jesus had done with the water in the jars. He did not know that this wine was not part of the original plans for the party, at least not so far as the bridegroom was concerned. So he approaches the bridegroom and expresses surprise and says to the bridegroom that he is shocked that he has broken custom, serving the best wine last. This was not customary according to the text. So to fold the story back into the allegory of wine, here is demonstrated life when we least expect it. It surprises us in ways one might have trouble articulating even, like us invited to a fancy wedding reception. Hard to put into words sometimes. And here is why my mind went at first to those moments in life when I felt that I was invited to a party far better than I'd ever hoped to attend. And yet, rest assured, I was invited. And here, Jesus is teaching the disciples that life with him, life in the realm of God, is like that. Here is life that defies expectations and blesses us beyond measure. Here the disciples can decide which is better, life produced in the old ways under the old systems, life that disappoints and eventually runs out, or the new life prophesied of old by Isaiah and the other prophets, life into which Jesus is leading us even now, was leading the disciples into back then. I think that as we observe our culture, and most every culture throughout time and history, the old ways of making wine, of cultivating life, have proven themselves to be, to put it mildly, underwhelming. Sure, there have been some highlights, but by and large, the old ways of making wine have let us down. The old wine may captivate us and cloud our senses, even distracted by advertisements and consumer culture and other things besides, but ultimately, its promises have fallen short. To contextualize the metaphor into our own time, our consumer culture, along with its staunch individualistic outlook, have not satisfied. At least many have been left disillusioned and unfulfilled by it, myself included. At the wedding, Jesus revealed to his disciples that he and his ways were the door, the pathway to a fuller and richer life than this. The text puts it simply, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And for us today, reading the story, taking it as it is, the glory is revealed, and we are left with a similar choice. We today and in every age are left with a similar choice. Will we reject the old ways of making wine, of attempting to cultivate life, or will we turn to the ways of Jesus? Will we turn away from our culture's assumptions about who is blessed and about how power works and about what is a meaningful life at the end of things? Will we leave that and instead believe in the gospel, which is good news? The gospel of Jesus, which insists that the last will be first, that the lowly will be lifted up, that the peacemakers will be called children of God, and that all persons are made in God's image and are therefore our kin, our responsibility, and worthy of love. Some would call this outlook painfully naive. Jesus would call this wisdom and the way to life. The disciples were asked to leave behind life as they known it for a life that is fuller, richer, and ultimately more satisfying. They could not have seen it at first, but would come to see it in time. And the same is true of us today. We are called to reject much of what we've been offered by our marketers, politicians, and even our religious leaders. Instead, drink deeply of the life Jesus offers. The wine pressed for us by those who hold institutional power in our time has been, by and large, squeezed from rotten grapes. So turn to Jesus and the richness of life he offers, and engulf life beyond what you had before dared to dream of. Contrary to popular opinion, his way is the better way.